Hi, everyone. This is the Efficiency Equation, a show for plant managers spilling hard-earned wisdom and secrets in the search for the efficiency code in liquid manufacturing. I'm Constantine, together here with Eugene, and today we're hosted by Dan Rennie. Let's dive in.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Efficiency Equation. My name is Dan Rennie, and I am jumping in with the two Paradisov gentlemen, Eugene Paradisov and Konstantin. Welcome, guys, to the show. And today we have picked a topic that is sort of the 800-pound gorilla at many of the plants at manufacturing facilities across the country. And it is something that Konstantin has come to call the Rework Monster. It is eating up profits. It's biting into efficiency. It's definitely not good for your indicators. And we're just going to talk about why it is present in our lives and, more importantly, what to do about it. So again, welcome, Eugene and Konstantin. Let's dive in. What exactly is the Rework Monster?
To understand what we mean by Rework Monster, let's just talk about what people think of when they talk about rework. So there are different levels of failure at the plant, and you have some examples where they completely mess up the product and it has to go to waste. So that is not rework, that's called scrap. But if we now start looking at the lesser offenses where the product is messed up, but it's still salvageable. Now, when they reprocess that, that's the category of rework. And the funny thing is that many plants, they have a code name for this. I will not give you away the actual examples of code names because the plants will know who we're talking about, but they're different. And they don't call it a screw up. They call it something specific. It's a code name. So we made product X this time. And everybody knows that they messed it up and they have to reprocess it. So that's like the most obvious example of rework. And that's easy for everybody to understand and agree on. But then you have the lesser offenses where you're making product and it's off spec. It doesn't meet your quality specification or it doesn't meet your customer specification as far as what's supposed to be in it, and then the food and beverage industry, that's very important. So the products have to meet internal spec for quality, and in many cases, they have to meet the customer spec. So when they make something off spec, the question is why? Was it human error that somebody was asleep at the wheel and didn't do something in time? Or is it that the wear and tear of equipment prevented it from being done right? And so you have these lesser and lesser offenses. And in some cases, it's like a huge deviation from the spec. In some cases, it's a very subtle deviation. And then you have customer returns, which require reprocessing of the product, especially in food and beverage industries for safety reasons. But we like to separate that out and treat customer returns as separate, not as your normal day-to-day operation rework. So when we talk about rework, we're really talking about reprocessing because something was off spec. We're not talking about scrap, even though that's horrible, but it happens. And we're not talking about customer returns. And so there you get into this issue where right now, why we dubbed it the Rework Monster is because it's something that affects a lot of plants and to a different degree. And it's not talked about. And one of the reasons it's not talked about is because talking about rework was cool in the 80s and 90s. And in the 80s and 90s, we had Toyota production system. Everybody wanted to be like Toyota. We had invented all these wonderful tools with Six Sigma. And so manufacturers were talking about how cool it is to use those to weed out all the inefficiencies. Then later on, what happened was some companies in some industries got really good at it. And one example is like in the microprocessor industry, somebody like Intel would make sure that there is less than 1% defects in everything that they make. So for them, it's old news to talk about this. But there were many other industries that sort of didn't follow suit and didn't invest as much into making sure that there are no defects. And so for them now, it's different. They didn't get to the level of Intel, but it's not cool to talk about how much rework they have. You see? So if you search for it, you will not find stats on how much rework this or that plant has. There aren't even many studies covering this topic right now, but it is there. And the obvious consequence of having this rework is that they're spending time and they're spending money on reprocessing whatever it is that they make.
What's your experience with the food and beverage and oil industries? Where are they in terms of rework? So you mentioned obviously processors and some other industries where there are much higher standards, they have minimized or eliminated rework. Where does the food and oil industry stand?
So food and beverage and edible oils, they're all over the place. They have some products that are tightly regulated where FDA comes in and looks at that stuff. And so usually those are made at a very high level of standards. And then for everything that is less sensitive, it depends on the plant, where you go, and on the product. And so you have this broad range of where you can meet rework and how much rework that is. And one of the challenges with this is that people see it differently. So different levels of management, those managers, some of them might see it as rework and as something that should be rooted out. And some might see it as just normal occurrence at work. So we get into this whole cultural perception thing with this. And as we talk about the food industry specifically, there is this notion that everything in production has to go through the quality control lab. And as they make the product, there may be several checkpoints where quality samples are taken, and then they're analyzed by the lab, and the lab will tell you if it's okay to move forward, if that sample is approved or if that sample is rejected. And bigger plants, they will have many of those samples going through the lab every day. And so when you then start to think about rework, it's very important in what context you're thinking about it and how you're measuring it. So you can think of it in two ways. You have OEE, which is overall equipment effectiveness, and that many plants try to measure. It's a measure that indicates how well the plant is doing overall in using its equipment. And part of that metric, a component, is quality. And literally, quality is 1 minus rework. That's the definition. However, the operational definition of rework in that sense may be different from plant to plant. And why? Because the textbook doesn't prescribe how each individual plant will actually measure their rework. It just sort of gives you the example that seems like a no-brainer when you read about it, but then when you bring it to your plant and try to translate it into real measurable results, it gets tricky. And one of the reasons why it gets tricky is because people generally don't like to be measured. And so once they start getting measured, they start looking for loopholes in the metric. And if there are loopholes, they'll say, oh, that's not a valid metric. That can't measure me. Or they'll say, well, if you're measuring rework in 4 different ways, and I find that 3 of them are unreliable, let's only leave one. So what companies do very frequently is they would fall into this trap of looking for a perfect definition that everybody agrees on. And of course, the measured parties don't want to be measured. They would frequently disagree. But once they get to that, they make it so narrow that a lot of things would pass as good, as normal, as right first time products, even though they might have otherwise been considered rework. So the problem with rework in OEE is just because of how hard it is to get everybody to agree that this is considered rework, this is considered rework, this is considered, that's what makes the definition narrow.
Konstantin, I'm thinking of a good analogy for the lack of a standard when it comes to rework and the lack of a specific definition. And I'm thinking, what would happen in the field of medicine if we didn't have a specific standard on what constitutes high blood pressure or what we define as normal blood pressure? And I'm thinking that would cause a lot of confusion. And I'm sure it was, and it took time for cardiologists to agree on what high means for a certain age group and what high means for another age group. But they eventually got there, and that made medicine a lot better. And same with anything in medicine where they, came to an agreement that, okay, this is high cholesterol, and below that, it's normal cholesterol. And so do you think that the industry is sooner or later going to arrive at standards so that, plans can actually be comparable to one another? Is that even desirable?
Point to make is that these are ranges. If you talk about blood pressure, it's never a number, it's always a range. And the same idea would be employed here in identifying what rework is, and how to count this, and how to say, well, we have a lot or we have a little of rework. It's always a range, it's never a number. And the range is because there are variations that inherent to a specific process, specific plants, specific industries. So there's always going to be a, a range of things that you could consider okay, and then outside of that range you would say, okay, now it's worrisome, that we need to work on it and do something about bringing it back into the range.
Yes, I was going to add to, I agree with what Eugene is saying. The very first reaction is, yes, it's a good analogy to make to try to understand this, how complex this may be for some. But you have here, you're talking about blood pressure in medicine. And when we come to look at different people, they all have blood pressure. In what we're talking about with rework, the factories are all making different product. So setting the standards would have to be tricky in that it doesn't mention what product is being made, and this is where we get into the weeds of it with the food industry, with their quality samples, because they're making the product. And if you try to sort of abstract away from what product it is, it seems reasonable to say, if you're reprocessing, if you're redoing something, that's the activity we want to capture. And so it gets back into how can you measure that? And so we've worked with customers that try to look at it in 2 different ways. One way is through the whole operational efficiency, the OEE metric, and that gets to the level of individual batch or individual production run. And they're trying to kind of bring everything together and say, did the operator hit the button to identify something as rework and reprocess it? If yes, then that's rework. But if they didn't, and then there were some other minor adjustments to the process, that may not be captured as rework, even though it is really rework. And so that one gets tricky. But then there is a whole other way to look at it with the right first time metric. And what we've seen is that the quality management for the company would usually set the rules. And the rules would be uniform across different manufacturing plants. And when they look at it, they look at product, run, batch, lot number of product, that whole unique category. They look at the quality samples from the lab and say, if we look at the quality samples for that batch, and they may be more than one, and you might have had first few rejected, but in the end it was approved, then it's subject to the definition of what the first few rejected are. Are they there to sort of indicate that something needs to be redone, or are they there to just sort of take the temperature check along the way until you get the right temperature, but you are still going in that first run, you're not reprocessing anything? That's where it becomes tricky. So we've seen people say, as long as in that grouping there is one approved sample where everything is great, we don't care that the first few were rejected. You're good. That's right first time. And it's a decent metric. However, the thing is, once you get your metric for a day, for a week, for a month, and you look at your score at the end, and it's expressed as a percentage, and let's say you get 90% right first time, that automatically tells me that the other 10% are not right first time. So that's the indication that something needed to be reworked. That's your 10%. And so the question is, what do plant managers, what do middle level managers, quality managers do about that 10%? Do they go into deep dives with root cause analysis and figure out how to improve it for the next month or not? And this is where these different solutions and systems come in. If a plant looks at it and says, oops, I got 60% right first time, 40 was not right first time. Oh, well. And then the next month, it's the same thing. Then they're not actively looking to improve. But the ones that do look to improve, and it starts with the mindset change that they should be competitive, they should be improving, they look for solutions that make that whole tracking and reporting easier, that also make the root cause analysis easier. So that's where we've spent some effort with our customers working on those types of solutions.
And when you talk about right first time, you have to always be mindful that the percentages that Konstantin just said, the one percentage that is not right the first time does not really mean that all of that is rework, right? So if you have 60-40, for example, 40% not right first time, doesn't mean that it's all 40% rework, because some of it could be wasted. Some of it could be just a wrong product made, and now you just have to figure out what to do with it, maybe store it for a potential other customer that comes around and orders that product. So it's not necessarily all rework, but rework is somewhere in there. And to capture that, you need solutions that allow you to say, all right, these are the right first time, so these are good. There's nothing wrong with this. But these other 40% or 10% or whatever that is, that's not right first time. So let's find out how much of that is actually wasted, how much is reworked, how much is good product, just needs to now find another customer to take it. So those things are not easy to identify sometimes, but if you have the right solution and the right mindset in place, they can deliver a higher efficiency plant.
Guys, and without obviously mentioning names, do you have any rework horror stories that come to mind from the past 12 years or however long you've been doing this, or even longer? Does any story come to mind?
Yes, stories do come to mind, but to some people, they're not horror stories. That's, again, the whole conversation about change management and continuous improvement mindset, whether you have that or not. And we've seen that usually it's the higher level management that is more open to getting into continuous improvement, getting more competitive. And then as you go down the ladder, you have some more resistance. And there is something where some factories would have rework where the middle level and the lower level personnel sees it as part of day-to-day operations. So to them, it's normal. And it's the process design that's inefficient. So if you're making something, and we are now talking real reprocessing, real rework, you're making product to spec. Then your product doesn't meet the spec. The lab says, oh, no, this is no good. And they send it back. And now you are either reprocessing that alone or you're mixing it with another product that is good to dilute it and to bring it back to spec. Now, if you're doing that and it's a regular occurrence where you're doing it several times a week, then the question is, why are you doing it and can you improve your process? And to the people at the lower level, this is just normal stuff because they were told, here's yet another production order, go do this. They might not care that this is reprocessing. They might not care that this rework eats into their profits. But as you go higher with the plant manager and above, they may want to have a different view on this because they know that that eats into their profits. And so it gets a two process design. And yes, we've seen in some places where this percent rework, when you look at it holistically as a percentage of day-to-day operations, is very high. It's in the double digits. And it's, again, it's a mindset game that this shouldn't be your normal process, that you make something and then, oops, surprise, we have to reprocess this. It should be that you make it and maybe you do spot checks along the way to make sure that the parameters don't change. But when you get to the end, it should be in the range of what's expected. And so this is where we've seen that different plants, different manufacturing plants making the same product differ in how they approach this. And that's why we're able to talk to you today about it, because we know that while there are some that do this and then they get surprised and then they go back and reprocess and they think it's normal, there are other ones that make the same product that don't do it, that actually go through it only once, and then those plants are more profitable. So that's, without naming names and specific numbers, I can tell you that that can be pretty serious. And again, it's all a matter of people at the lower level not recognizing it as a problem because to them it's just another thing they have to deal with. But then the people at the higher level maybe not paying enough attention to it. But then you get to the other plants and it's very different. So it does certainly help for plants to share best practices within the industry, even within the same company.
I'm glad that the word mindset came up several times because, and I just want to add another concept there, which is education. I mean, when the core of the problem is that people on the shop floor don't realize that rework is actually a problem and not a necessary part of life, then that comes down to education, doesn't it? So if it's the responsibility of someone at the plant manager level or even higher, then it's their job to basically let the people know that, hey, you have to have an eye for this, that this is not just, things going in the normal direction and it's not a part of life. So would you say that it comes down to education and communication, top-down communication?
That's certainly a big component of it. Education and training, I would say. And thank you for pointing this out because training has been an issue across many different plants to some degrees, where operators frequently lack motivation to train in new ways and new systems. And so plant managers who hear this would agree with me that it's not as easy as just deciding, oh, I'm going to train my people on this. And then tomorrow you just train them and they're all good. They all got it and they're working. It takes iterations. And one thing that comes to my mind with this to help address that issue specifically, we implemented this AI assistant in the system for the shop floor operators. So those operators that are not veteran operators, but maybe newer operators, and they're not very sure, even though they went through that training, they might not remember parts of it. They're not very sure what to do next. They can interact with the system that's aware of what they're making, where they're at in the process, and ask the system, help me out. What do I do next? And the system will tell them, oh, based on what I see, you are like 33% into your process. You've completed this step. You need to start your next step. And the prerequisite for that is go and add some additive or do whatever you need to do. So we're able to at least help those plant managers by giving them this new technology to help address the lack of desire to train in new stuff. So because if there's lack of desire, then they don't retain a whole lot. They retain some of the new information, but then if you give them additional tools that will be there to help them when they do things the new way, then it would make it easier for them to start doing things the new way. So that's training is always a hot topic in that how do you train the operators and make them retain the information that you just gave them. So I think that's good that you brought it up. But yes, the mindset change is that everybody at the plant should own the results. And if you care about your results, you care about putting out good product, you should be interested in looking at how to avoid the waste that comes with reprocessing and reworking everything.
If I can add something on the questions you put on before. So you said about horror stories, right? And like Konstantin mentioned, horror stories would be horror for some and just regular stories for others. And in that case, you would probably look at the angle. What does a horror story mean? A horror story means that it's scary to somebody, right? Somebody doesn't like seeing that. Who is that? And unfortunately, with rework, it usually goes to people that are not necessarily involved in rework itself. So it would be somebody in finance or accounting, maybe even plant manager level, somebody who has to answer for why there's this inefficiency in the process that causes bottom line to be worse than it could have been. And that kind of gets removed from the actual day to day processes at the plant. So it's not so much horror for the people running the equipment, doing the processing, as it is for people that have to account for it at the month end or at the year end. So that's where the stories could have been told by saying, okay, how am I looking at these numbers that don't make any sense? Why are they lower by this much? And unfortunately, it's a snowball because one rework in the month, maybe not that bad. But if you get a few, then they snowball. And at the end of the month, you will see a horror story. Now, that was about that. About training, I wanted to add a couple of cents there. So, training is very important, but there's two types of training. One training is that Konstantin was referring to when you actually try to make the operators or whoever you're training to grasp the new material, to understand it, and to be able to execute their job function based on the training they received and not forget what they were trained on. That's very valuable. That's needed. It's lacking in many respects, like Konstantin says. In many cases, management skips on training or skips on enough training. They get a little and then they forget and they don't invest into continuous, refreshing of what they need to be doing. But there's the other aspect of training that needs to be mentioned in this case. And that is understanding of personal versus team responsibilities and outcomes. That is the one of the main factors why rework is never talked about openly, because many people take that personally and say, okay, if I'm doing something and I have to say that, well, I'm reworking something right now, that's bad look for me. And that philosophy, as long as that stays with people, you will always have issues trying to figure out what was rework and what was not, because nobody wants to look bad. Just by definition, we all want to look good, like we're good workers, like we know what we're doing, like our processes are great when we run them. So accepting the fact that it's not your personal responsibility, but the overall process that wants to be improved, and you flagging off things as rework actually helps the company to look at issues, find why that happens, and address it. That's the important part of the training, that is not based on just educating people where to press buttons. It's the understanding of why we're doing it and who benefits and who is not at fault for it, because you don't want your operators to feel that they are at fault for rework, because if they do that, they will find every loophole to avoid flagging something as rework. So you almost want to incentivize the operators for truthful telling of what rework is and what isn't, and then you can look at it and say, okay, now we know that's where we need to work.
Yes, totally agreed. I
That's a
wanted
great
to
point.
wanted to add to that about real experiences. We were at one plant where there was this kind of misalignment, in that operators, they first didn't want to open up to us when we were working with them, but they eventually did once we explained to them that we're there to help them with their daily work to make things easier for them. So they explained that there was a system of punishment for screw ups, whether they take off points and they accumulate them or whatever they do with besides reprimanding. But there wasn't a system with incentives for how to improve the business. And so when we ask them openly, well, how can this particular procedure be done more efficiently? What do you think? How can you do this better? They had ideas, they had answers. They didn't share any of those with the management back then because there was nothing in place for them to come and speak up and share this. So nothing happened, but the bad things were happening. So we flagged that to some of the people in the management so that they would reconsider how they would incentivize their workers to do things better. But yes, that's a very, very good point. That does happen in the 21st century.
Wow. Wow. And I was going to say, I mean, you guys have probably seen a few turnarounds where inefficient and horroristic plants were turned into efficient factories that were more easy and even more enjoyable to run. And so if somebody's listening to this episode right now and they're thinking, okay, I ought to take a look at this thing. Let's see how much we're reworking. Where do you suggest they start? And the follow-up question to that will be that you guys are obviously software vendors. So do you have a magic bullet that if you just install into your factory like that, then the problem vanishes and the sun comes out?
Well, on the software part, just to address it real quick, software is always helpful if used correctly, if it deployed properly, but it's no easy task to do so. There needs to be an expectation that anything software related is rather a tool that can help you navigate through the process of making rework somewhat a thing of a past. I mean, some rework will always be there. We just have to accept that. There's no way around it. But minimizing it is the goal here. And can our software or some other software help you? Yeah, of course it can. But before you get there, right? Before you actually say, "Oh, we need this thing or that thing," and then we're good, we're golden, no rework. That is not necessarily the case unless you tackle other things first, which we talked about before with the mindset change, with education of people not taking things personally, but rather looking at it from the lens of holistic approach, saying, okay, what ails us? What are the pain points? Let's address them. Things like that. Konstantin, you want to add?
Yes, I was going to say, to me, that goes like this: mindset at the higher level of management, then the people that are going to be implementing the work. I'm talking about the shop floor operators and the quality labs and all of that. And then you have the software, right? So you start with the mindset that you want to look at continuous improvement. There's always something to improve to stay competitive. And then you look at who are your players that are going to be involved and in what ways do we need to deliver the message, like all that stuff Eugene was talking about with training. And then if you want to get more specific, you can certainly have the plant manager ask the question, okay, do we track OEE, overall equipment effectiveness? If we do, what do we do about things in there that show up as rework? Do we just say, oh, we had so much rework this month and that's it? Or do we actually follow up on each individual one and do root cause analysis? Ask yourself, is my definition of rework in my OEE too tight? Is it looking like most of my product is 100% quality or 90% quality each month? If you're that high, you're probably missing something. And if you're looking at RFT, right, first time, ask yourself, are you doing enough by looking at what's not RFT? And as we mentioned before, some of it might be scrap, it's just total waste. Some of it is rework. Are you following through on all of that? And as you try to think about all that, that's where you realize that doing that on spreadsheets might be very cumbersome and difficult, especially with the follow through. So you want easy access to information. You want easy trend analysis. That's where all these different solutions exist to help you with that. But it starts with the mindset, then the people, and then you get the systems. So you align the desire to improve, and the systems are there and waiting to help you. But anybody can take a piece of software and try to use it in a way that it wasn't meant to be used, and then it will not work. It will not be efficient. So as long as we understand that everything is made for a purpose, there are systems that will make your lives easier.
It's almost as if you need to learn the rework monster, understand its ways, accept that it's there, that that's the 800-pound rework monster in your room. And once you have accepted and learned its ways, now you need a tool to effectively squash it, right? So that it cannot rear its ugly head frequently and upset your bottom line and upset your efficiency. And that's the tool that could be the software system, the software solution. That's the tool that you can use. But before you use it, you need to accept that it's there, learn about it, learn how it affects you, learn how you can potentially minimize it, and then get the tool to actually get the job done.
Awesome. That's a perfect closing statement. Is there anything else that we wanted to touch upon when it comes to rework and making some people's lives miserable, but not all people's lives?
I mean, the only people whose lives could be miserable because of rework are the people that are, in the end, have to take responsibility for why the bottom line is not as good as it could have been. And those people would fret the day they have to report if they know that there were issues with rework and all of a sudden your bottom line doesn't look good, but they always, if they don't have the good tools to track this and to work on that, it's always going to be some kind of story why things happened and why it's nobody's fault and it's just that and or this. It's really hard to nail anything down if you do not accept the fact that it's true, that it happens, and that you want to deal with it, and then take the proper measuring tools such as OE metric or RFT metric, use those to see what makes you miserable at the end of the month when you have to report your results, and potentially get a solution that helps you track all those things in a more convenient and, straightforward way rather than doing it on paper or Excel spreadsheets or whatever it is.
I want to add a little bit to that. Just two things. There is this old saying, the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging that you have it. So that's one. The second one, I would say, don't start with the focus on the software or on the systems. Focus on the process. And as you frame the scope of what you're trying to improve, looking at the process and looking at where the inefficiencies in the process are is very, very helpful. We've had a lot of success with our customers by first starting to analyze the existing manufacturing processes and finding the weak spots and talking about what could be improved. So this is where the whole continuous improvement, lean manufacturing, Six Sigma comes in. That's valuable because it allows you to then focus on what matters when it gets to software. And software is a tool. You can give people tools for everything, but if they get tools for things that they don't need, for problems they don't have, they're not going to get used. So to make sure that you're not wasting your money when it comes to systems and software, first focus on the process. And there are people that can help you with it. Look at the process, see where the weak spots are, talk about how you can address those, and then match the solutions to those spots.
Super. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm real excited for the next one. And it was great talking.
Guys, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you could find some valuable insights from this episode. We'll be releasing new episodes soon, so stay tuned. If you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, suggestions, or just want to chat, you can find us on LinkedIn. Links are in the description. See you next time.